What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am here to deliver to you another band's discography ranking. Apart from the last Horseman podcast episode that happened on Sunday, this is the first one I've done in a little while by myself, and I thought to myself, I've been into this band almost non-stop for over a year and a half, and I'm wearing a thrash metal shirt, so why not pick a thrash metal band? And I figured, how about we go to my personal favorite of the German thrash scene, and that is Sodom. So, yeah, let's get ready to dive into the history of the band. Well, actually, before I get into the history of the band, let me give you a little backstory of how I got into the band. So, I never fully dove headfirst into Sodom. I mean, I knew the name, and I listened to a few songs, and I liked what I heard. But I didn't get really as into the band until about midway through last year, when I discovered on YouTube their Lords of Depravity documentary, both parts. And I watched both parts, and I love the documentary so much, so I was like, you know what? I've been needing to give this band a fair shake, and I decided to dive into their entire discography, and wow, I couldn't believe how amazing a lot of these albums are. And you're going to find out how my opinions about them when we get into the ranking. So, with that being said, let's get into the history of the band. So, Sodom formed in late 1981 by a guy named Frank, who would go by the name Aggressor, and a gentleman by the name of Thomas Such, who would later go by the name Tom Angel Ripper, and still is there to this day. And together they were jamming on guitar and bass and vocals, playing along to like Venom and Motorhead, among so many other bands that they were into mutually. And then they needed a drummer, so they came across a gentleman by the name of Renner Falk, who would later go by the name of Bloody Monster. And this was the first lineup of Sodom we had, which was a very short-lived lineup, as Bloody Monster would leave the band, and so Frank and Tom needed to find another drummer, and they decided that they would pick up Christopher Dudek, I believe that's how you say it, Dudek, otherwise known as the late great Chris Witchhunter. So they came across him because they thought he looked a little bit like Fast Eddie Clark from Motorhead, and they were all really into Motorhead, like really into Motorhead. And so this would be the new lineup, and they would record a couple of demos during 82 and 83 before eventually some tension was forming between Frank and the rest of the guys, to the point where they were out of their rehearsal space, and Frank at first fired Tom and kept Chris, but Tom was leaning more towards being friends with Chris Witchhunter, so Chris and Tom said, no, we're kicking you out, and that was that. So it left it down to Tom and Chris to carry the band on. And at first they almost picked up Mila Petroza of Creator, but because Mila had already gotten Creator going back when they were known as Tormentor at the time, Mila couldn't do two bands at once, but Mila picked a good fit for them, and they picked up Joseph Dominic, a.k.a. Peppy, otherwise known as Grave Violator. So here we get the lineup for a couple of shows, and eventually in 1984, late 1984, early 85, their first EP in The Sign of Evil, but we're not going to include EPs in this ranking, otherwise In the Sign of Evil would be top 5, easily, but as we're not putting EPs into the conversation, it's out. So this lineup stuck around until about midway through 1985. Grave Violator was having some conflicts with Chris Witchhunter, and then along came, and then they would pick up Michael Wolf and would go by the name Destructor. And together with this lineup, they would record in late 85, early 86, their debut album, Obsessed by Cruelty, on Steamhammer SPV Records. Now, the interesting thing about this album is that there are 2 sessions of this album that was recorded during this time. The original session, which was actually released through Metal Blade Records in standard tuning, The label thought, this does not sound very good, you need to try again. And so they switched studios and producers and did a re-recording of the album and added an additional song, After the Deluge, featuring Uwe Christophers, who was known by the name of a.k.a. And yeah, 2 versions, one in standard tuning and one in D tuning. But combining both versions, I have Obsessed by Cruelty at number 5. I think this is one of the most raw thrash albums of the time, and it's actually very influential on black metal, like particularly the Norwegian scene. A lot of those Norwegian bands picked up on albums such as this to create their own scene and their own style of music, being Norwegian black metal. But this is still a very thrashy album, and both versions are really good. However, I think I prefer the original recording that was released through Metal Blade in '86, where it's in standard tuning, because it's just more energetic, in my opinion. And plus, I think the drumming was better. While the guitar playing was kind of sloppy, it adds to the charm of this album, and that's the reason why it's my number 5. There are some really good songs on here, like Death Like Silence. Yeah, that name would be synonymous with Euronymous with the label Death Like Silence Productions. You even get some other great songs like Proselytism Real, the title track being one of my personal favorite Sodom songs of all time, Volcanic Slut, Witch Hammer, Brandish the Scepter, just so many great songs. Even though, yeah, the recordings on both versions were pretty sloppy, it adds to that charm of the raw energy that Sodom was able to project during this time. So, after the release of Obsessed by Cruelty, Michael Wolff leaves the band because he felt out of place, because he was more of an introvert type of individual, and would eventually join Creator, but for a very brief period. So, when they were playing live, Uwe Christophers would play live for the band during the Obsessed by Cruelty tour, and then eventually Uwe couldn't really keep going anymore, because he'll even admit he was not that great of a guitar player. He had to cheat in certain ways to play some of the songs live. So eventually they ended up hooking up with none other than Frank Blackfire. And Frank was a good friend of Tom's. They always hung out at Tom's place. And eventually Frank and Tom started to understand a mutual bond over thrash metal, particularly the American scene. You know, bands like Metallica and Slayer going strong during this time. I mean, hell, '86, you have 2 of the genre-defining albums with Master of Puppets and Rain and Blood. But Frank kind of convinced the band to kind of push themselves as far as songwriters and really come up with some awesome songs. Early 1987, we get the Expers of Sodomy EP, which was another great EP, but then later in 1987, we would get the release of their second album, Persecution Mania. Now, Persecution Mania is my number 1. I kind of figured this would be my number 1 because, I mean, this is where I feel like their black metal elements and their thrash metal elements were kind of merged together much better here, because it's super thrashy all throughout, but you get some black metal moments in terms of the vocals, because Tom Angel Ripper's vocals early on were very black metal inspired, but here you even get some kind of death metal moments too. After all, Sodom, not only were they highly influential on black metal, they were highly influential on death metal just as much. So you kind of get, it's like an extreme metal blender in terms of the influences, but it's still very much a thrash album, much more thrash forward than Obsessed by Cruelty. There are some incredible songs, and also lyrical content shifted away from the satanic occult stuff into more political, religious, Vietnam-based lyrics. And this album, holy shit, there are some fantastic tracks. Nuclear Winter being one of the best songs in the entire Sodom catalog. Electrocution, an amazing cover of Motorhead Iron Fist. Christ Passion. Bommenheigel, which is still one of the biggest anthems in thrash metal history. I mean, and you guys who have seen my channel before for the Marvel Studios Cup, last season, that was the main theme song, and it might stay that song, possibly. Possibly. But yeah, top to bottom, a Thrash masterpiece. It's still very raw. This was when they eventually picked up Harris Johns as the producer, and Harris had already been doing work at the time for Creator and Halloween, and even, I think, around the same time, Voivod. So yeah, Sodom made a good choice at picking a producer who knew what the hell they were doing. But that was Persecution Mania, so this lineup with Tom, Frank, and Chris would go on a big European tour for Persecution Mania. Although they'll even admit it was kind of more solely a promotional thing, because there was not a whole lot of money left, because they were into really getting drunk and just having fun. So, and during this time they recorded the legendary live album Mortal Way of Life. However, shortly thereafter that, they would go back to Harris Johns in the studio and record their next album, Agent Orange. Now, Agent Orange is my number 3 album. I know some people are going to think, why don't you have this in number 1 or number 2? There's another album coming a little bit later that I just liked a little bit more than Agent Orange, but you can't deny, Agent Orange is another thrash masterpiece. I mean, this album, top to bottom, and the production gets a little bit more clear, it's a little bit more polished, but it still retains that evil grit that Sodom has had pretty much throughout most of their catalog. And here, the songs get faster, they get a little bit kind of almost leaning towards death thrash a little bit, like some of the black metal was pretty much gone by this point in favor of perhaps a little bit of like that death thrash style, because Sepultura was going strong around this time too. So kind of a kinship between those two bands during this era. And hell, even for the Agent Orange tour, Sepultura opened for Sodom. So there you go. But, I mean, Agent Orange, the songs themselves, the title track, Tired and Red, Incest, Baptism of Fire, Oskabombed, another gigantic thrash anthem. Definitely when they do these, like, anthemic tunes, like Bommenheigl and Oskabombed, they embrace a little bit more of a punk influence, too. I completely forgot to mention that with Bommenheigl, but it kind of keeps that going with Oskabombed. But yeah, top to bottom, just absolutely incredible songs. What more can I say about it that nobody else has said? However, after the recording of Agent Orange, Frank Blackfire started to feel a little bit distant from the band because he wanted to pursue other things around this time and was kind of not getting along with Chris Witchhunter. There's a theme with a lot of departures during this time. It was because they couldn't get along with Chris Witchhunter, the drummer. But in this case, Frank kind of did a bit of a dick move, and he left the band about 2 or 3 weeks before they were going to go on tour with Sepultura opening up for him, and joined Creator, who was doing an American tour with Coroner at this point. And it left the band in a bit of a pickle, so for the remainder of '89 when they did the tour, they picked up Uwe Ballstrach. I'm terrible with German names, I'm sorry, who came from the band Mekong Delta, which was a lot more of a technical, proggy thrash band. So he was able to learn all the songs really quickly and do the tour, and the tour went off without a hitch. So then, after Uwe left to go back to Mekong Delta, Tom and Chris thought, okay, we need another guitar player for the next album and the tours, and they would pick up Michael Hoffman, formerly of Assassin, another German thrash band, and they're kind of legends in that scene. Even Tom Angel Ripper said that he loves the old Assassin records, and that Michael Hoffman was no slouch on the guitar. He was a dark horse in the German scene because he could play anything and everything. So together, in 1990, Tom, Chris, and Michael would record their album Better Off Dead. Now, Better Off Dead was quite the shift in style. It kind of went away from the more death thrash style and into a more speed thrash style. Like, there's some speed metal coming in and a little bit more melody coming along too, with like the guitars not as in your face and pummeling as the previous two albums, but it's still a great album. I actually, though, have this at number 7 overall. I just feel like a couple of the tracks, they kind of were going a little bit too far with the speedy stuff, but when it gets thrashy, it gets fucking thrashy. Songs like the title track, Captured the Flag, there are some great songs on here, but the two songs that stood out the most to me on this album was The Saw is the Law, particularly the extended version that was released as an EP shortly after, but it was from the same session, and the song Resurrection, because Resurrection was very different from anything you had heard from Sodom. This was more kind of like as if AC/DC and Merciful Fate met and did a song, but with Tom Angel Ripper doing vocals. Because this was very melodic and a very passionate song lyrically, because it's weird. I gotta talk about this song lyrically because, you know, they started out with the whole satanic image inspired by Venom before they changed it to the more war-based stuff. And here, and Tom Angel Ripper has gone out to say that he doesn't believe in religion. But here, this song, he's basically telling you to believe in God. Granted, this song was a tribute to his father, who unfortunately passed away during the recording of this album. But still, kind of mixed messages, Tom. But regardless of how you feel about his flip-flopping about his religious beliefs, this song itself, Resurrection, is a beautiful song, one of the best, more kind of traditional heavy metal hard rockin' tunes that Sodom ever did. So there you go. But yeah, The Saw is the Law is the standout for me on here. The title track, Captured the Flag. Even their cover of Cold Sweat by Thin Lizzy was really well done. It's just it falls a little bit because it did lack a lot of the intensity in favor of melody, but I do appreciate it for that, but I did kind of miss the intense moments. But don't worry, we're going to get those intense moments very, very quickly. But before we get there, another lineup change. Michael Hoffman was kind of at a crossroads after the tour was done for Better Off Dead. He as well was not getting along too well with Chris Witchhunter. However, here he was offered an opportunity to be a guitarist, producer, engineer in Brazil. And he thought, well, how about we move to Brazil and we do the album here and we can hang out by the beach and drink from coconuts. But Tom and Chris kind of looked at it and thought, well, if we do this and we're there for a few months and the album turns out to be bad, that wouldn't be the best move. So they decided to stay in Germany to work with Harris Johns, who also produced Better Off Dead, leaving Michael to just say, okay, I guess I'll just stay in Brazil and you guys keep going. And they would eventually pick up an unknown guitarist by the name of Andy Brings. And together, Andy, Tom, and Chris would go back with Harris Johns, but they went to the Dick Studio, which was the biggest recording studio in Germany, and went out and produced an amazing album in 1992, Tapping the Vein. This is my number 2 album. The reason why I have it above Agent Orange is because this feels like the continuation of Agent Orange, but building off on that and getting a little bit more brutal on this album. Like the death thrash I heard in Agent Orange got pushed even further here on Tapping the Vein. Like even Tom's vocals got lower and more gravelly on this album. Like songs like Body Parts, the title track, the Crippler, his vocals get quite low for himself. But you still get the token Tom, did I say Tom Warrior? I'm sorry, Tom Angel Ripper. You still get the Tom Angel Ripper style vocals, the more higher, like, grizzly style. But here, not only does that death thrash style get pushed further, we get some new aspects, like songs like Bullet in the Head and Voctrum, being a little bit more punky, kind of a precursor to what you would hear them do for the next few albums. But the heavy guitar tone on here and the drums sound excellent. the bass is quite prominent on here. Like, in terms of the best produced Sodom album, this is it, but it doesn't lose that heaviness. This is unbelievably crunchy, heavy, and brutal. Like, top to bottom, this is an album I can go and jam right now and probably have a stiff neck the next day from headbanging a lot, especially the title track. And even their longest song, I think up to this point, that they ever did, which was called Reincarnation, the closing song, it was so fucking epic and kind of doomy a little bit as well. So some more new ingredients kind of getting thrown into the mix. So after the release of Tap in the Vein, the band went out on a big tour, including their second time over in Japan. They were in Japan the year before for the Better Off Dead tour. Here they were back in Japan for the Tap in the Vein tour. However, after the Japanese tour, tensions were mounting once again, this time between Tom and Chris, because the band, Tom and Andy, had started to notice by this point that Chris Witchhunter was starting to panic a lot, especially during the recording sessions for Tap in the Vein. Apparently, according to Harris Johns, he was very nervous during a lot of takes on the album. And also, he was becoming a really bad alcoholic during this time. And the band felt that Chris was maybe about ready to leave because he was going through so many personal issues during the time. So Tom and Andy decided to let Chris go to see if he can get better and get his personal issues sorted out. And that was pretty much the end of an era for Sodom for a lot of people. Once Chris Witchhunter left, things change big time for the band, because eventually after they had Chris leave, along comes former Living Death drummer Atomic Steiff, who was a very excellent drummer and a great fit for Sodom right off the bat, because he could play anything and everything on it. So, together with this lineup of Tom, Andy, and Steiff, would come together and would have a bit of a different sound in mind. In 1994, we get the release of Get What You Deserve. For me, Get What You Deserve is a really good album. However, the reason why it's a bit of a shift is because this was more embracing further into the speed metal, but a little bit of punk, like crossover period here. We're into the crossover thrash period of Sodom in the mid-90s. But then again, around this time, many thrash bands changed their sound to see if they can evolve. You know, bands like Metallica and Megadeth going more traditional metal, Anthrax going more groove alternative, Slayer still stuck it out for the most part until the end of the decade. Creator was going more gothic industrial, Destruction went groove. Sodom here, they still retained the thrash sound, but added in more speed metal and punk on top of it. And for me, Get What You Deserve is my number 11 album, I believe. Let me double check. No, it's my number 12 album, excuse me. It's my number 12 album. It does fall quite a bit because, yeah, this is a very, very different album from the rest of Sodom's discography, because some people shit on this album. I don't understand why they think this is terrible. I think it's really good. Yeah, a couple of tracks did start to kind of sound the same the more I listened to it, but I love the punk energy and that more grit that was there on the album. Granted, the album cover's kind of crap, but aside from that, this album for me is really, really good. I come back to this one quite often. But yeah, it definitely falls lower because there are albums better than this one. But that's just my personal opinion. Songs on here like the title track, Die Strom Ursel, which was more kind of a upbeat song all about sex. Also songs like Freaks of Nature, Gomorrah, the fuck was there? Unbury the Hatchet, Fellows in Misery, kind of keeping that kind of Motorhead vibe going. And then you get songs like Silence is Consent, which is a really good song all about the slaughtering of whales. So we get some different lyrical content on this album as well. But yeah, it's number 12 for me. But after this, when they went on the Get What You Deserve tour, tensions mounting once again, this time between Tom Angel Ripper and Andy Brings. Andy was starting to fall apart in the band, and Tom kind of noticed that too. And also, big age difference, 8 years in age between Tom and Andy. Andy was only in his early mid-20s at this time, while Tom was in his early 30s during this time. So yeah, big age gap between the two. And Tom said that that was one of the reasons why it didn't work out in the end with Andy, but also they were starting to have some personal issues that eventually got resolved. But after Andy Brings leaves, we get Strawley as a guitarist, who's more of a punk guitarist, coming from a punk band out of Germany called Unwanted Youth. And together with Tom and Steiff, in 1995 would record the album Masquerade in Blood. Masquerade in Blood continues that punky thrash style, but adding back a little bit of the death metal elements and a little bit of groove metal at this point, because this was around the time groove metal was becoming big, or was big, so they kind of wanted to be a bit current at this point. For me, this is my number 14. This one falls a little bit. It's not great, but it's not bad. It's a solid album, because there are a lot of good songs on here. Songs like Mantle Man, Scum, Murder in My Eye, the title track. There's some really good, Gathering of Minds. There's some good songs on here. But the production, yeah, they got heavier in their guitar tone. They went down to C tuning. But the production was a bit murky on this album, and yeah, this one's not looked at fondly by a lot of Sodom fans. I think it belongs. It's a solid piece of work, but it was very, very inconsistent, at least in my eye. But after the recording of Masquerade in Blood, Strawley ended up in jail because of drugs and stuff, and that, as well as conflict between Atomic Steiff and Tom Angel Ripper, led to a brief breakup for the band in 96. Like early 96, the band was done for a period, and then Tom Angel Ripper would go on to do Uncle Tom Angel Ripper, his solo project, which is still going today. However, it'd be through those sessions, as well as doing work with other musicians, he eventually finds two new guys, Konrad Skakowski, nicknamed Bobby, and Bernd Burnman Kost, who played together in bands in the past, and together reformed Sodom near the end of 1996. And they're still on Steamhammer at this point as well, and eventually would come back to work again with Harris Johns for co-producing, and in 1997 we get the release of Till Death Do Us Unite. And this one's my number 15. This one goes down a little bit because a lot of songs on this album, they were trying to get back to the traditional thrash roots, but it still had that punk exterior to it. And also lyrically, I felt they were losing a little bit of imagination lyrically on this album. And it just doesn't grab me necessarily as much as most of the others. But it's not dead last. We'll get to that one later. But yeah, this album just didn't have much memory to me, and that's really the nicest and the best and the worst thing I can say about it. It's not bad. It's solid for what it is, but it falls for me because it just doesn't grab me necessarily. Though the song "Fuck the Police" was pretty catchy, and that was good. But it would be after the Till Death Do Us Unite tour, Bobby, Burnman, and Tom decided, you know what? Let's get back to what Sodom was all about back in the day, in the mid to late 80s, early 90s. Let's get back to proper thrash metal. And Tom agreed, and they weren't on SPV Steamhammer for this album. They were on Pavement Music, I believe, or Drakkar Music. And in 1999 would release Code Red. This is my number 6 album. welcome back to the classic thrash sound. Just, oh, it was so cool to hear them going back to their roots a little bit. Still has a little bit of that crossover influence. It's peppered in there, but it's not as apparent because, yeah, there are some shorter songs, but you get some good, solid meat potatoes tunes on here, like The Vice of Killing, the title track. There are some deep cuts on this album, and The Vice of Killing is one of my favorite Sodom songs as well. It's so catchy and so riffy and just awesome. And the album cover is really cool too, kind of going back to their old covers a little bit, with a dude in a hood with the bullet belts and the axes getting ready to just fucking kill and murder everything in his path. And this album kills and murders everything in its path, which is why it's my number 6 album. So, after the success of Code Red, the band eventually got back on Steamhammer SPV Records, and together decided, you know what? We did some of these lyrical themes on Agent Orange and Persecution Mania. How about we do a whole concept album based on the Vietnam War and about the film Apocalypse Now from the 70s? And they thought, this is a great idea, this is going to be ambitious, let's go for it. And in 2001, they released M16. This is my number 4 album. Holy shit, is this album hostile or not? Like, holy fuck. These songs, like the production, and once again, back with Harris Johns, and this album is really raw in a modern sound, and I can't believe this album's 20 years old. What the hell? And you get some more melody coming into their thrash metal sound. Kind of a little bit of like Agent Orange and Better Off Dead kind of combined. And it really, really works. Like, the melodies on this album are very beautiful. Like the song, like the opening melody on Napalm in the Morning, which is the signature song off of this album. But among the Weird Kong and, oh my god, there are so many incredible songs on this album. I Am the War, Little Boy, Genocide, the title track, Marines, and a really fun cover of the Trashmen's Surfin' Bird. Oh man, just this whole album, top to bottom, masterpiece. And I will say, in terms of their post-Chris Witchhunter era albums, this is definitely the best thing that they've done. But they've written some other great albums since then. But yeah, M16, my numero, uno, dos, tres, cuatro, my numero cuatro. There you go. I was trying to remember my Spanish 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s there, and I forgot for a second. But after the release of M16, the band went on a huge tour all around the world, playing Thailand for the second time. They played there once for like a one-off while they were relaxing from their Japanese tour, and played a few songs in like almost Hawaiian clothes. But they went back to Thailand, they played all over the world, and even, I almost forgot to mention that during the Till Death Do Us Unite tour, they finally played in the States for the first time for the Milwaukee Metal Fest in '98, I believe. But it was a disaster for them, and they didn't play the States since until 2005, when they got offered a North American tour with Fintroll opening for them, and they were kind of hesitant because of what happened with Milwaukee and if their music would be received. But they go out on that tour and it's a massive success. They're playing all over the States and Canada, Mexico. It was an amazing tour for the band, and they've been playing the States a lot more since then. However, it was during this tour time they started the recording and writing process for their next album in 2004, but there was so many problems with producers leaving and not being able to get anything done until they eventually got Andy Brings, former guitarist who was becoming a producer at this point, and he offers to help produce their next album. And finally, after so long with delays, in 2006 we get the release of Sodom, their eponymous album. This one fell for me a little bit. This one's my number 13, Although this is a really good album, there's some great songs on here, like, what's the one that I always remember? Blood on Your Lips. Blood on Your Lips was the standout. It was the opening track. Wanted Dead, Buried in the Justice Ground, City of God was great. The problem with this album is the production. You can definitely tell there was some issues because of all the different producers leaving. Andy tried to make the best of a bad situation during this time with the production. But he tried his best. He did try his best. However, like, Tom's voice got a little bit better on this album, and the melodies were much more prominent on this album. This was kind of like Better Off Dead Part 2, but the production kind of makes this album suffer just a little bit, in my personal opinion. But still really good songs on this album, and what more can I say about it? So then, after the release of Sodom, the band, or mainly Tom, wanted to do a one-off project for Sodom, and that's get back together with Chris Witchhunter and Joseph Dominic, a.k.a. Grave Violator, to do, because the original idea was SPV wanted to re-release In the Sign of Evil, but with a couple of bonus tracks from demos of songs that almost made the cut for the EP. Because that was originally going to be their debut album, but they decided to make it an EP instead when they were doing it. So Tom decided, maybe not do a re-release. How about we do a new recording of the album with songs that would have been on it if it was a full album? And in 2007, we get the release of The Final Sign of Evil. This is my least favorite album. This is number 16. It's not that it's bad, it's just, again, first, the production's pretty terrible. I mean, we're in the 2000s. There shouldn't be an excuse for bad production at this point, unless it's Darkthrone album, where it's endearing. But not only is the production bad, the biggest reason why it's dead last is because this album didn't need to exist. You already had In the Sign of Evil, and that was perfect in my opinion. You didn't need to re-record it in today's day and age, and yeah, and also the recording, the playing is pretty sloppy, like much more sloppy than their early output of music, and that should tell you a little bit of something. However, during this time, Chris Witchhunter thought that after this he could rejoin the band, and he was already picturing in his head what he could do, but it was just wishful thinking on his part, because Tom wanted to stick with himself, Burnman, and Bobby. So it kind of was a bit of a blow to Chris a little bit. And unfortunately, during this time, in 2008, Chris Witchhunter unfortunately passed away after liver failure, after battling alcoholism. He was only 42 years old. And the death came as a big shock to the band and to his former bandmates, especially Andy Brings, because it's in the documentary. If you watch the documentary, it was pretty well known Andy Brings and Chris Witchhunter did not really get along after Chris was booted from the band. And Andy still feels bad to this day because he wanted to make peace with him, but couldn't because of Chris's unfortunate death. And it took him a long time to get over it, so sad ending there. But also during this time in 2007, they played Wacken and had pretty much everybody that was in the band, apart from Michael Wolff because he had passed away in 1993 in a motorcycle accident. Uwe Christophers because he felt embarrassed to be out on stage. Chris Witchhunter because he was not in the best shape at the time. And who was the... And Strawley, because they had no idea where he was after he was in jail, and he would eventually pass away in 2011. But every other member that was in the band for a studio release, Grave Violator, Frank Blackfire, Michael Hoffman, let's see, Atomic Steiff, all Andy Brings, all on stage doing songs with Tom, Bobby, and Burnman, and it was an incredible show. But after all the tragedy and triumph during this period, The band goes back to the studio in 2009, and then finally in 2010, we get the release of In War and Pieces. This is my number 8 album. This is another fantastic release from Sodom. The production gets way better than anything they've done since M16. Like, holy crap, does this album sound nice. And great songs on here like Hellfire, Through Toxic Veins, Storm Raging Up, Soul Contraband, Nothing Counts More Than Blood, God Bless You. There are just some fast and furious yet very melodic tunes on this album, kind of keeping that melodicism of what they were doing on M16, keeping it intact on albums such as this. And yeah, definitely give it a listen. However, this would end up being the final studio album with Bobby in the band. He eventually left after the release of In War and Pieces, and eventually would pick up and would recruit Maka, otherwise known as Marcus Freewald, who was in bands such as Despair and Voodoo Called, currently in Bonded, and he would eventually join the band for the next 2 albums. So we get this lineup with Marcus, Burnman, and Tom, and in 2013 we get the release of Epitome of Torture. This album is my number 11. This is another really fucking good album. It just falls because there are albums I like more than this one. But this one, you get a little bit more of that, you get a little bit of the punkiness back a little bit because there are a couple of fairly short tunes, but the thrashiness and the melodies still intact. Songs like Sodom, the title track, My Final Bullet, Cannibal, Tracing the Victim, Waterboarding as a bonus track was fucking killer. I mean, top to bottom, this is a solid album from Sodom, and what more could you ask for? At this point in the game, just keeping consistency going. That's what you can do nowadays. So then after Epitome of Torture, this lineup would stay together for another album. 2016, we get the release of Decision Day. This one's my number 10. I looked at this as a big improvement because the songs got longer again and a little bit more melodic, but a little more intense at the same time. Songs like Vaginal Born Evil, Who Is God, the title track, Sacred Warpath, Blood Lions, Strange Lost World. Really, really cool album here, and even the album cover is fucking amazing, you know, with the American flag and the Russian flag with the mascot in the middle. Everything's burning because, well, you know. But again, another solid release. They just continue to stay consistent, and again, what more could you ask for from this band at this point in the game? However, this would end up being the final release with Marcus, and this would also be the last album for Burnman, who was in the band from Till Death Do Us Unite up until 2018. And as far as who we get on drums, for a couple of years we get Stefan Husky Huskins, who was already in Asphyx at this time. Great addition for a short period of time. But we get a returning member. Frank Blackfire comes back into the band for the first time since Agent Orange in 1989. And also, new second guitarist, Yorick Seagates, would join as a second guitarist. So for the first time ever in Sodom's history, we get 2 guitar players for the lineup, which is really, really cool, so they can do more guitar melodies and harmonies going forward. And this was a great idea. However, this lineup was only 2 years, because early in 2020, Stefan Huskins left, so he can focus primarily on Asphyx, and would pick up a young budding drummer by the name of Tony Merkel, who was already the drummer in Frank Blackfire's solo band, and together with this lineup in just last year, around this time last year, would release Genesis 19. This is my number 9 album. This is definitely the best album, in my opinion, that they've done since M16. or since in War and Pieces, I would say, because, man, the songs get a little bit more raw. There's even a couple of longer tracks on this album. I believe... No, they don't surpass Reincarnation off of Tap into Vein. That's still the hallmark for the long songs. But we get a couple of long tracks on here, like the title track, the Harpooner. Just awesome tracks. Glock and Roll. That's one of the best song titles ever, and man, that song is super thrashy and aggressive. Occult Perpetrator is solid, Indoctrination's great, Friendly Fire's cool, Sodom and Gomorrah, and actually, a bit of an Easter egg for you, the opening track, the opening 1-minute instrumental, Blind Superstition, was a little riff ditty they did as the opener on Mortal Way of Life to lead into the song Persecution Mania. So they actually did a studio version of the song. It's not as good as the live recording from '88, but it's still fun. And it's cool that they actually put it on a studio album finally after all this time. But yeah, I've looked at this as one of the best albums of last year. I fucking love it. And I recommend you guys check it out. And that wraps up, wow, nearly 50 minutes of the Sodom discography ranking. And this was kind of challenging because this is one of my all-time favorite thrash bands. And they kind of have that punk spirit of we do what we want. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But they are one of the best bands that doesn't have a bad album. Even the bottom ones are solid for what they are. Not bad, not amazing, but still enjoyable nonetheless for different reasons. But what is your favorite Sodom album? What's your least favorite Sodom album? And what, in your opinion, would you say is the most underrated album? For me, favorite Persecution Mania, least favorite The Final Sign of Evil. Underrated? Tapping the Vein, hands down. But until next time, horns high, and I will see you guys in the next one. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Hey, can you fix this for me, please? I sure can. Okay, let's see what we got to drink. Ah, fucking perfect. Ah, some good old Powerade. Delicious. No, not really. You know what I like to have every morning? A nice sandwich with some Clover Valley creamy peanut butter. But you know what else I want to do with this? I want to dip my balls in it! Let's see what we got in here. Damn it, we don't even have Spam in here! Whoa!